We're coming, and we ain't backing down.
We don't need a bunch of cats in here looking in the mirror.
Everybody just do your job. You understand that?
Hey, will you shut up?
I'm bitterly disappointed with the officiating today.
Guys being dudes.
And they run through our like through a tin horn, man.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you, Les. Alex, a little bonus episode today, eh?
A little bonus episode. Very excited to have on Richard this week. Some of our wonderful colleagues who not only work with us on different Moon Crew properties, but who wrote a book with us. And we are excited to talk about that book.
Yes, indeed. Let us bring into the show Spencer Hall, Tyson Whiting, and Jason Kirk. The five of us wrote Sinful 7. Welcome, gentlemen.
Howdy.
Hey there.
Well, hello. Hey.
Do you guys want to identify yourselves one by one for anyone who might not listen to the Shutdown Fullcast or who, and I don't know why they wouldn't, or who just might not know who you are?
Sure. I am Spencer Hall. I am currently a contributor to the Moon Crew and to the SEC Network. I am one of the hosts of Thinking Out Loud on Mondays, 7 o'clock on America's favorite league-oriented, conference-oriented network. Also, I'm one of the people to blame for the Shutdown Fullcast, the internet's only college football podcast. I don't even know what podcast I'm on right now.
My name is Tyson Whiting. I am a senior designer at SB Nation, secretly working with Moon Crew and all their design needs. I was responsible for all the beautiful images and piecing all these insane puzzle pieces together to actually make a finished product for the Sinful 7 book.
Thank God for you. Thank God for you.
Yeah, and howdy, this is Jason Kirk. Affiliations include Moon Crew, the Shutdown Fullcast, and the Vacation Bible School podcast.
All right, so okay, I guess for those of us, for those listeners who don't know, listeners to SZD who just think me and Alex only care about college football, you're mostly true. But basically, as you guys have sort of heard us say before, we got furloughed in April from SB Nation, as many of you know, and when that happened, basically, as the story goes, Jason hit the five of us. Well, I should say it was four to start. Me, Alex, and Spencer, and we got on a Zoom, and we're like, "You guys want to write a book?" And Jason sort of knew the tech behind it, and the Gumroad storefront and all that sort of stuff. And then a couple weeks in, it became readily apparent that we're going to need some drawings. So we hit up Tyson. And 3 months later, presto, a book appeared. We're going to get into some BTS behind the scenes, all that sort of stuff. And we're going to do it just via questions. We solicited questions from our folks all over the interwebs. And they're really good. And so I guess I'll just jump in. The first question comes from Jim Lomar. Did y'all begin from the history of college football story angle or from the American Western one? And I think that may be the best question for Spencer.
I think the idea was always to do it another way. So, yeah, I guess the answer is to do college football history, but never to ever engage with the genre that was historical writing. So does that make sense? I think we started with the concept of writing about the history, but with the intention of we're totally going to bolt it onto like a Western. Does that seem right to everyone's memory?
Yeah, So how I recall it is basically we had like this pot of ideas and we were throwing stuff in it, right? Like Alex wanted to write about this weird episode in NC State history. Richard wanted to write something about Jack Trice. Spencer, the internet has wanted Spencer to write a Western for literally years. And we sort of are like, how do we combine these things, right? And then we sort of hit on the idea of like the NCAA versus the Wild West, which is more or less the plot of Red Dead Redemption 1, with, if you adjust the metaphor slightly. And we realized, like, hey, we can just do a multi-genre book that is literally that story, the NCAA versus the Wild West. So, yeah, to me, like, as far back as I can remember, the very beginning of the idea was, like Jim mentioned, basically a history of college football angle and an American Western angle.
That was kind of like how you guys pitched it to me. I think the sentence was, do you want to make images for a book that's Red Dead Redemption and college football? And I go, yes, please.
Basically, for anyone who is listening who is not yet familiar with the book, but is interested in learning about it, we decided to write this book that was both a trip down college sports history that was kind of oriented to show how college sports came to be organized the way they are today. And we told that story on one track. And then there was a track running, well, I wouldn't say parallel, but kind of crisscrossy and running in a very weird way alongside it. That is this story that we built. So there was part real history about the way college sports came to look like this, the NCAA that you know and don't love, and how, on the other hand, 7 very serious bandits robbed a train. And I think the funny thing for us is that the fiction, it's kind of wink, wink, nod, nod, not really fiction.
Yeah, there's no real, and I think all of us have sort of interfaced with this over the last few years, but there's no real interesting way to write about the NCAA and its sanctions and its rules and its rule book. Like, it's all dry, it all sucks, and readers have stopped reading it. I mean, honestly, if you ask some of our other friends in media, like Nicole Auerbach, Chris Vanini, and friends of the program that you guys have all heard and probably follow on Twitter, even they'll say, like, the NCAA stuff, investigations, all that kind of stuff, that stuff doesn't traffic like it used to. I think that attitudes have well and truly changed around amateurism and all that sort of stuff. And I think writing this in that sort of pivot point in the history of the sport is what makes it such a great story. And just given the fact that we got really gonzo with it and just wrote something that explained college sports and was also fiction. I mean, I remember when Jason laid this out, and I remember the first Zoom, Spencer had a Red Dead map from the video game and had sort of our various plot points all over the map. And I literally remember getting off the Zoom call and being like, I do not know if this is going to work. I don't get it.
Which is how you know it was a great idea.
Yeah, Richard, I mean, I think the reason the litigious, keeping up with a modern NCAA case, the reason it's not interesting, there's probably 2 reasons. One being everyone is kind of over it. We realized around the time of Cam Newton, Johnny Manziel, that the NCAA is the bad guy here, right? Most people sort of came around to that idea, but also it's settled history. The NCAA has been the same thing for at least 30, 40 years with no real major changes. So this book, what it challenges and supposes and goes back to look at is what were those turning points? What were those times when it became the solidified thing that it is, when it became the monolith? Because that wasn't destiny, that was choices by people. So that was, in terms of historical journalism, Kentucky.
Specifically,
we there were a lot of schools and figures that we kept coming back to and realizing wow, they were really important in the grand scheme of things. In Kentucky, man, y'all kind of messed up a little bit back there in the early 50s.
It's Kentucky's fault.
The part about the historicization, right, or historicalizing it, however you want to say it, was just to put it in a larger American context. I wanted to show that the NCAA and amateur athletics was not some exception to our otherwise noble history of labor relations, but rather the norm, that it was like a lot of other things in American history, which was to take a racket and then, in the name of order, legitimate it and build an entire structure around it that was called the way we do things, and to normalize it and to make opposition to it seem truculent or criminal. And that's really, and not to take the people who are necessarily against it as heroes, but to definitely make them seem like at least they had the principle of self-interest, which that's not the NCAA. You can't even claim that an investigator can't go and be like, well, at least I'm getting mine. No, dude, you're getting a paycheck. You're not even as clearly defined as a villain here. So that was my little sideline here, was just to sort of always point it in the greater tradition of, do you feel like you're being screwed? Okay, here's another example of that.
We're sort of already answering this question, so I'm just going to sort of surface it from Georgia is a verb. Did y'all agree on the plot points up front, or was there a ton of improv style yes-anding going on? And I think before I sort of swing it to Jason, because Jason is definitely the best person to answer this question because he's edited sort of all of us, and I think Tyson as well as sort of the person who kind of bolted on after working with us. I've told people a lot about this summer in the fact that I don't think this book happens on the timeline that it does, in the time frame that it does, if it's 5 mercenaries getting put together. The reason this works, the reason it flowed from a workflow process, from a story process, is because, in a writing sense, the 4 of us have quite literally finished each other's sentences for at least 4 years. Jason and Spencer go farther back than that. There is a trust that I think you have to do something this ambitious. And that even is sort of most gratifying in the fact that Jason says this all the time, that I was defensive coordinator to the train robbery, which is sort of our biggest centerpiece. I sent that back to Spencer dozens of times. And, you guys, the people that listen to this know Spencer Hall as this titan of college football internet. And that's how I knew him too before I worked with him. But the trust that he sort of afforded me to get in the weeds with his part of this story and vice versa throughout the whole thing was sort of the most gratifying process, Jason.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, in terms of process, it was awesome for the 5 of us to all be each other's first readers, And we had other people come in as well. Ryan Nanny was extremely helpful. Jordan Ginsburg, the people we had that we thank on our first 2 or 3 pages, a lot of people contributed. But it was awesome to have a group of 5 people who, we all valued each other's input. And yeah, in terms of big picture, I went back and looked at our notes from the first week of May, and it's amazing how many of the big points were just locked in just right away, right? We knew exactly which stories Alex wanted to tell, the stories Richard wanted to tell, and Spencer so the behind the scenes thing is we agreed that the nonfiction chapters would sort of be the boundaries, and then Spencer would sort of color in between those, right? So Spencer was inventing within those spaces, and I think from very early on knew that we wanted to progress from meeting a bad guy, meeting gangsters, and getting to train robbery where you're rooting for the gangsters, but everything that happens interim is sort of being colored and affected by what we're discovering and what we're unearthing from the nonfiction chapters. So the big plot points, they were locked in roughly 3 months before publish. There were lots and lots of details to discover and tweak and change and scrap, but yeah, the big posts were there the whole time.
I think it really helped, by the way, that none of us knew what we were doing, and that's really good. If you're, Richard's well, there's a lot of trust in letting me in. I was I don't know how to frame this. If y'all know how to frame it, you'd come in and go, well, how about that? And I'm that's a great idea. Wow, that's way better than the idea I had. And I think that worked the other way too. I think it also helped that, one, we do trust each other a lot, just implicitly. We've all worked together before, and we all do things that the other can't do, and that's really cool. And we also had, I think, outlets. All of us had outlets. If Alex wanted to do something, he'd do it in a nonfiction chapter, and that's how he would get his legwork out. Or if Richard had an idea, and it wasn't going to quite fit with my thing, well, once we divided up into these kind of double novella structure, Richard could go hog wild on that. He could just okay, yeah, cool, we're gonna do this. For instance, are we doing spoilers here for anyone who isn't listening?
Yeah, let's put it. I know where you're going, so yeah, let's put a spoiler alert. Say from here on out, we're spoiling everything. But yeah,
okay, yeah, from here on out, we're spoiling everything. Okay, because this is a big one. So if you haven't read it, or if you're just do this, I want you to skip about a minute ahead, okay? And then we'll be clear of this.
I think from here on out, we're just letting them fly. So
okay.
Go buy the book and read it and come back in a couple weeks.
So when Richard, when Richard came back and said, "I want to kill George Wallace," we're okay, go ahead. I think maybe something that at the onset would have been that's a goal we'll have to work toward. We'll have to set it up. But when we got in the process, by the time that I would do this. this actually all happened. Like, Alex was like, well, I really want to write a little bit more about this wild Kentucky NC State case, which, like, we're all like, sure, go ahead. Just like do it. That'll be perfect. We need that. And Jason would come in and go, I think this needs more of a biblical structure. And we're like, man, that sounds totally logical. And Richard would come in and say, I'm going to kill George Wallace. And at that point, everybody, we're already out on the limb. How far out do you want to go? Well, you can keep going, till it snaps. Like, till you read it, it doesn't work. But you'd come back and look at what everybody had done and gone, well, sure. So, in other words, me coming back and going, I turned Boston College and Villanova into a couple of professional witch investigators for hire. That's, nobody blinks by the time you're there.
I think the George Wallace thing is actually really a great example, because when I was initially reading all your drafts and everything, and like thinking about art and like the George Wallace thing, like as someone who's coming in from the outside of the like college football world, it's like how bad is this guy? And so I'm reading through these drafts, and you guys kind of structured it in a way where I want him to die so badly in the end, and it's like oh, he, like kill this guy off. It's like, oh, what does that mean to me? And it's like, now I'm invested and I want him to die, and so it makes it so much more interesting. Like the way you guys tailored that idea into the book, it didn't just happen. It was like built up to, and it felt really good.
Yeah, I think that's an example of where, all right, that's what we want. We want Jack Trice murders George Wallace. Who doesn't want that? That's fun for the whole family. But let's set it up as much as we possibly can, right? So, like, all right, now half of a fiction chapter before that is building him up as the bad guy. And then Alex's Kentucky nonfiction chapter before that, we make sure we make mention of, hey, there's this asshole George Wallace who is, and we tie him to Bear Bryant. We show how Bear Bryant should be standing up to George Wallace. So, like, yeah, we tried to set him up as a mini boss, like we did with the NCAA as well, as sort of the final boss, I guess.
It's kind of funny because all of this feels, as we're talking about it, and it was kind of slapped together initially, but it helps. It helps that there are some pieces of glue, or I guess pieces of tape, string that just kind of keep everything together that we didn't come up with. Like Bear Bryant is an example of this. This fucking guy, Bear Bryant, pops up in everything.
You cannot tell the history of the sport for like a 60-year stretch without
it. Yeah. It is downright Forrest Gumpy, which Roll Tide.
Yeah, and so that makes it a lot easier to go from, that I wrote a chapter about Kentucky kneeling before the NCAA, and we'll talk about that later, I'm sure. You might wonder, how do you get from that to George Wallace getting killed by Jack Trice? Well, you get there by Bear Bryant, because Bear Bryant was at Kentucky. Bear Bryant, of course, leaves Kentucky. He goes to Alabama eventually after another stop. By the way, there was another stop at Texas A&M. That becomes a chapter with Jason.
Uh-huh.
Then he goes to Alabama. Who does he become really good friends with while he's at Alabama? Is it not the most famous segregationist governor himself, George Wallace? And now we have someone. Now we have someone we can kill. And college sports are just such a small world like that, that even if you are just throwing shit at a wall and just saying, well, yeah, I want to talk about this, it can be cohesive because so many of the same characters and through lines exist without us having to do anything.
Yeah, and like we have all the way back to Alex's the second chapter. Alex is sort of the overview of the first 50 years of NCAA history. You find ways to mention Bear in there. Like, it's amazing. And he became sort of one of several through lines for us. The other one that, this is jumping way ahead, but like Walter Byers, sort of the man who turned the NCAA into the modern thing it is, and then later had sort of this redemptive revolt against the NCAA. He's one of my favorite characters that Spencer fictionalized. And one of my favorite chapters is in the middle, is just Walter Byers going on a quest into the mountains by himself. But he's another through line. Like, he's got to be mentioned in like half of our chapters, more or less. So, like, the interconnectedness of college football, there's some of that stuff we planned, and there's some of we discovered, like, at the last minute. Like, at the very end, we have Walter Byers, by way of a character named Ann Arbor, turning against the NCAA with his final manifesto. And in real life, we didn't even plan this, but in real life, Walter Byers' autobiography against the NCAA was published by the University of Michigan. Didn't plan that at all. But.
Do you remember the day that I was like, Jason, if somebody's trolling me, there is no way this is true.
I already know what you're going to say. This is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. The other big thing we didn't plan but discovered.
It's you were looking at Jack Trice stuff, right? And you were looking at like his dad's name or something. Was that the
Yes.
that blew
Yeah. Jack
my
Trice
mind
is
out of the water.
I literally I thought you were gonna bring that. I forgot about that. Jack Trice's grandfather's name is George Wallace, and I remember like that stopped me in my tracks. I just it was incredible. I mean, it still is incredible to me. I forgot about it, Tyson. I'm glad you brought it up. I literally forgot about that. I mean, it's insane.
Because like we didn't discover this until 2.5 months after we had the idea that Trice kills Wallace. And then we discover, oh, not only are there obvious reasons to do that, there's like cleansing the family name. And like, hey, what's our Jack Trice chapter about? Naming a stadium, right? It's about names and legacies and lineages and legends. And like, I don't know, we can act like we planned that, but like, what a gift by...
I laughed for like a week straight.
I remember, and this shout out to Josh Kagavi, who is the man as far as Iowa State and Jack Trice research goes. I remember like hitting him up, DMing him, emailing him, being like, "Is this true? Can you verify it?" He literally showed me I think it was a marriage certificate of Jack's parents that confirmed it. I almost didn't. I couldn't believe it. Could not believe it.
Did you? I have a question for Richard. And this was a cool feeling that I experienced, and I want to know if you felt it too. When you write about Jack Trice at all, even in a fictional sense, do you just feel like you're carrying something very precious and you want to be very careful with it?
Yes, and I knew it immediately. I owed it to Jack's legacy, to Jack's family, to Iowa State, and I am serious. I felt like I owed it to them to nail this story, at least particularly the nonfiction parts. I remember I had a call with a guy who had been working on a screenplay for Jack's story, and I remember at the end of the call, he said, "Welcome to the club of Jack researchers and Jack writers and all that kind of stuff." And I remember being like, "Holy shit." Like we have done a lot of stuff around college sports and all that kind of stuff, but and there's a question in here about what was the hardest chapter to write, and you can define hard and difficult in different ways. But as far as for me, what was the hardest chapter to write? I think it was the Jack nonfiction stuff. Not because the material was tough to dig through or whatever. Like, trust me, I can tell you everything that happened in that week in 1923. Because I read so many fucking newspaper stories about it. But like just the weight of his legacy, and particularly given what was going on in the world this summer, like knowing that this was a no pun intended, this was one shot that we could take that would really, really land if we nailed it right.
Yeah, and I think you did. It's my favorite thing you've ever written, which I think is a thing that I can say about everyone's contributions to this book. Like my single favorite thing each of you has made was in this book, which was very awesome and cool. You too, Tyson.
Tyson, tell me, Tyson, your creative process, all of it. How did you sort of adjust or whatever, how you work to sort of work with us in this sort of, everyday collaborative? That's what I miss, man. I miss the Zoom calls every morning with all five of us sort of bouncing stuff off Tyson and Tyson giving us the proofs and all that stuff.
Well, I think that was actually one of my favorite parts. I think the first meeting we had after we took a month-long break from this, when the book was finished, the first thing we said was, man, we kind of miss these, seeing your face and having these meetings almost daily. And the process for it was so easy. You guys were Richard, I think you mentioned that you guys each read each other's minds and finish each other's sentences, and it made me feel almost like a fortune teller, because I was a part of this, and it's I already know what you guys wanted based on just seeing what you've read, working with you guys a little bit before, and the process was so easy and streamlined. Because I think, kind of touching on another thing where something that was just thrown out into the open was, oh, let's just have Irish get shot in the head 3 pages in, and then it kind of spiraled into me let's just turn him into a zombie. And that moment, I was literally sketching a zombie in my sketchbook already ahead of that sentence, and it's this is easy. And then showing pictures of an extremely swole Irish zombie guy. Like, that was like getting inspiration for this was the easiest thing I've ever had to do in my life. It was just there sitting. All I had to do was just build around it. You guys made it so easy.
There's another question on here. Is like, what books, movies, games, songs, etc. Were your greatest influences in writing the Sinful Seven and writing in general? And I think I extend that to Tyson and sort of put it to Tyson first. Tyson, what was sort of your influence in how to do, all of this as far as drawing wise, map wise, all that sort of stuff?
So with the initial conversations that we had, I immediately started like looking at Red Dead Redemption art. I started playing the game again after I had already finished it like 1.5 times. And so I just kind of getting back into that type of inspiration. Spencer, you started bringing in stills from like old Western movies, and I started looking at the typefaces from those and even the coloring of those and how those were colored. I was looking at old photographs from the 1890s. Like I really dove into like, I want this to feel like a book that you're digging out of a trunk or you find under like a dusty barrel in like a ghost town. And so it was really easy for me to kind of start pulling from those things. And when I would kind of get too far out of the universe that you guys are creating, you would reel me back in. But for the most part, I could go as far as I want. You guys, I probably wouldn't tell me no. If I wanted to put a jetpack on that zombie, maybe you would have let me, but I didn't dare go too far.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, it would have worked, Ed. Like, no, you said jetpack on a zombie, and I was like, well, let's see. Like, they had compressed air back then, so I could probably
that's just yes, steam.
Right, or a large eagle picks him up, and they form into one magically. It's like see, we're already on the same page, so we know.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah,
and
but
Tyson,
as far as
go ahead.
As far as like video games and stuff, it was literally like old movies, like old photographs, and then like the kind of like new age video game renditions of like how that's being prepared, like portrayed now, and even like the new. I was rewatching like True Grit and stuff like that over and over again, just to kind of like get me in the mood. I had westerns on 90% of the time while I was drawing, so it was really, really great.
Yeah, I like, and the sort of the last question, sort of in this like BTS or whatever, is like, what are the differences in process between writing fiction like a novella and writing nonfiction like a long form piece? And Spencer, that's sort of the question that I want to pose to you. The links are the same as the question says from Tom Weber, but I imagine there are wildly different processes involved.
Oh yeah, it was really thrilling trying to. I'm glad we were working at a genre, because with a genre, that there are certain gates that you want to hit or have to hit, so when, it's interesting that this goes from the question, okay, well, what did you bring into this? Structure-wise, I brought in Chungking Express, which is a Chinese film that has two stories that are kind of connected but not at the same time, and they exist in the same film, and you don't really question it. That was kind of like once we divided the two, like that structure, once we divided the two stories up into, part one and part two, I felt good about it because I at least had a template for that. Having a template in nonfiction writing, which, I've done a lot of different ways to varying degrees of success, you're always sort of working along a story that you already know. Whereas when you're working with fiction, I found that the mechanics of fiction were much trickier than the mechanics of nonfiction because they're given to you in nonfiction, right? If we have to write a story about a sporting event, I already have start, middle, and ending. And I have a result, and I have two very clearly defined teams and the mechanics of how that's going to get there. There's going to be fumbles if it's a football story, and TDs and passes completed and rushing. Or there's going to be a race, and it's go from point A to point B, right? The hardest part of this entire process for me, honestly, was when you guys would come back and you would go, hey, so they were here at 3, but now they're there at 7, and I'm like, God damn it! That's housekeeping, right? But that's also what you have to do in fiction is you have to say, well, you're totally right. I have to get them there from 3 and 7, and I can't just leave them there. It's got to at least be semi-realistic. but I can't tell the whole thing either. It's like in a movie when you say, well, you got to show them coming in the door. Well, I don't have to show the knob. I don't have to show the whole thing swinging. You just, for somebody like me who's like super ADHD, you're just like, the door opens. Like, you have to, like, that's actually the hardest part of fiction storytelling for me, is the visual element where I'm deciding how to get you walking across town in the most efficient way possible, but also on time, so that all these other mechanics can happen, right? Like, Raymond Chandler wrote The Big Sleep. In The Big Sleep, the first chapter, Eddie Mars is killed. Do you know who you never find out like what happened? You never find out what happened to Eddie Mars. And Raymond Chandler, it's cited as like this big fictional device. Raymond Chandler just forgot it. He wrote the whole book and he forgot to solve the first mystery, and it became this big like, oh man, that's so noir. No, he totally forgot it. And that was the hardest part for me, with going, okay, I can't leave Eddie Mars. I can't, like every end that feasibly has to be tied together for the reader, right? Like, I have to at least bring that forward. And y'all were all insanely helpful, because you're not completely non-detail oriented like me. So you would go, yeah, so he has two hands, and you have him doing, you have him holding two guns in this scene. How is he shaking someone's hand? And you're like, that's a good point. Should probably stop doing that.
Yeah,
He's Mega Man. That's how.
Yeah,
I had no idea how to write fiction, because I don't read fiction. I haven't read fiction since like college. I'm like, what?
I think that helps. I think that really helps, because you just do it your own way. You're not like, well, it's got to sound like this person,
One thing that I thought about a lot while I was reading your guys' fiction chapters, and I did a little bit of fiction myself at the end of the book, is this concept of world building, which is something that Spencer and Holly had actually introduced to me. I think the first time I'd ever thought about the concept was when we were talking about something back when we all worked at Vox Media, and maybe I think it was like a Twitch idea that we had that we didn't do, but who knows, maybe we'll do it sometime in the future. But this idea of creating a world, and how that is a necessary facet of fiction that you have to do, that when you're writing about nonfiction, you obviously don't have to do, because it's all there for you. It's all right in front of you. I read a book, and this sort of goes back to the last question, but I'll try to be quick about it, that Drew McGarry wrote earlier this year, called Point B, and it's about teleportation, a teleportation love story. And I was thinking about that when I was doing some fiction writing in this book, and I asked him, so do you build the world first and then like put your characters into it? Or do you pick your characters and like pick your storyline and then build the world around it? And he said, and the way that I thought about it when I was writing after that, was you have to like put your characters on a path first and sort of build the world around that, because then like the way the world works will not get confusing with what your characters are doing. Like, I mean, Harry Potter did this really well, right? J.K. Rowling sucks. We don't like her, but those were my favorite books when I was a kid. And they did a great job of making everything in that wizarding world, which obviously isn't real, feel like it was necessary, even though it wasn't. You don't need, for instance, there didn't have to be a wizarding newspaper in Harry Potter. There didn't have to be talking paintings at Hogwarts and moving staircases. And I'm sure that when J.K. Rowling was thinking like, all right, we're going to talk about this little wizard boy who his parents get killed, and then he goes and tries to vanquish the guy who killed them and the most evil force. Her initial vision, I would assume, was more about that than it was about the moving staircases and all the spells. But because she knows where she's going, and again, she sucks as a person, so I'm just using her as an example of like a world building thing. She knows where she's going, so it all works. All the bells and whistles work. And Spencer, I think that you did a really good job of making sure that, transfer portals worked in this book, and that
that was the one thing, Alex. The transfer portals was the one thing where we were like, you know what? Fuck it. They just work.
I mean,
so this was when we originally threw out the idea of like sci-fi western. The sci-fi part was literally the transfer portals, and we just kept punting it. Like, are we going to figure out how this works or not? And we eventually decided, like, every character in the world, their interpretation of how and why these things work, it's valid. It's fine. Like, I think 4 different people explain it 4 different ways. Okay, so what? You know, like if you go to someone and ask them how a refrigerator works, they're not going to be able to tell you. You know, like they're just comfortable with this technology that exists for some reason.
That was, by the way, like when I talk about how much of the door to your show opening, right? Like, because my first instinct is just always go, I don't need someone to explain the plot to me. I don't read for plot at all. I just read for like cracking dialogue and like funny jokes and people crashing into things, and that's fine. You know, like Big Lebowski. If you watch a movie with Big Lebowski, if you watch the Big Lebowski with somebody and they go, "Man, I don't even understand the plot of that. That sucks. I don't get it." I'm like, okay, that is the opposite of me. Because I watch that movie and I'm like, plot makes total sense to me. Like everything that happens in this movie makes total sense. That's exactly my idea for a plot. And it was actually really helpful when it came time to do that kind of like, okay, just buy it. It was really helpful when y'all would get me from point A to B to C, because that made those points where you had to jump from A to Z and just say, just buy it. It made it so much easier. Like when Alex came in with the Pittsburgh Science chapter on the history of transfer portals.
And thank God he did.
Fantastic sentence to say out loud. It's brilliant because it was a gap where we didn't really fill in the whole thing, but we did just enough of it in exactly and distinct enough voice that I think it worked, right? I think like that was one of the funniest things. That was one of the funniest moments, was going, do we want a chapter on this? And Alex was like, yeah, I got it. It's like handing someone a plane and going, can you land it? And Alex was like, shit, yeah, got it. And he did.
We'll do the insert chapter ad nauseum a little bit later, because we need Alex's full sort of portrayal of that. But before we go there, there's basically a grab bag of questions that are like, what did we think about putting in the book and what didn't make it in? I guess Alex is sort of the first person I'll ask about this, because I think he's got some bear lore, or maybe that's Jason's bear lore in the notes. But I know Jason has some bear lore, and Jason also has some thing that he found in the May notes.
So Alex and I talked a lot about, Arkansas continually trying to hire Bear Bryant. Like this was a running thing for years and years. And we talked several times about approaching that from fiction and or nonfiction. And I think we wrote a sidebar at one point that we ended up not using yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, that was going to be a big thing. We talked a lot about Oklahoma because, if we're talking NCAA scandals, buddy, Oklahoma, honorary Southwest Conference until the end. Oklahoma went hard as hell. I think those were the main historical things. There's a question in here about whether we're always going to end with SMU. And I couldn't find any notes that we had at any point on a fiction or nonfiction thing after SMU in the 80s.
I think the original plan was to get it up to SMU, and then that was going to be the end.
Yeah, because that's a complete era, going from the NCAA is basically going from Teddy Roosevelt to death penalty, right? And then Richard's Money Train chapter about the 1950s to 2020s history of postseason money sort of fills in the blanks from there, Also, the thing I found in our May notes, it's not a college football history thing. It is a fiction thing. All right. So this was from lists of ideas about the bear character, fiction bear. I have no idea who proposed this, but quote, "Bear's hat has a mind of its own, like Mario Odyssey." So we talked a lot about Bear Bryant's hat. Like when does fiction Bear earn this hat, right? And this was going to be a thing in my chapter or in one of Richard's chapters, or and in the art we had this whole thing about he's got to earn the hat. That's when he truly and then we just who cares about the hat?
I have sketches of the hat Bear somewhere, and we had a fedora hat, and there was a top hat, and I had a golf hat type thing going. But I remember we spent a whole morning talking about this hat, and then a week later we just stopped talking about it. We just didn't bring it up again, and it did not happen.
Which is wild, because if you have a physical bear in a houndstooth hat, a checkered hat, it's that's immediately identifiable. But we decided to just go without the hat.
Yeah, Bear I think is the one character maybe that had a lot of, or maybe the most changes throughout, because originally I think Jason was only doing the bear thing. Because originally Spencer was going to do the Jack and the Wallace thing, or was going to end Wallace's story, and then Spencer was just like, "Why don't you do it?" And then so I was like, "Okay," and I hit Jason up. I was like, I basically need to take Bear from you, and I need to take Bear and Wallace from you and port them into my story so that I can kill Wallace." So Bear actually had a lot of machinations. I remember at one point he like didn't speak, and then there was another point when like he could only, like Wallace could only hear him or whatever. I don't know. He had a lot of different machinations throughout.
I threw a lot of weird ideas in my chapter. Like the way we set it up, the final version, right, where it's mostly Spencer and Alex with a Richard chapter is the first book, and then the second book is Richard, Alex, and me, where we have two separate stories that, by the end they dovetail. We joked about this a lot, that Spencer's story is the normal one. Right?
Yeah.
Like, that's not the thing most people would expect to hear. Like Spencer's story, which is wild and has, animals doing paperwork and like, Spencer's story is wild. And then it gets weirder. And like the Bear chapter, I had, at one point I proposed to Tyson that when the bear kills the Minotaur, he like wrenches the horns off of his head and jams them into his own head, and we have a Minotaur bear. That didn't go.
I have sketches of that as well, by the way.
Can you please send me, Tyson? Can you please send me?
I got it. Yeah, I'll dig them up. But there's things that you guys say, and then I have already begun sketching them before you finish your sentence. So there's.
I felt so good about that, by the way, because I don't ever get to be the straight setup man in any way. And it was fun to do because it was very deliberate, and it was like built on a genre with a definite narrative, like right down to the fact of adopting a central event, which has been the key event in like the first important Western. And from that point on, it's been like the centerpiece that something gets robbed. Like I watched Stagecoach and 310 to Yuma, right? And the Great Train Robbery. Great Train Robbery, by the way, is like a good 40% of that first book is just trying to figure out the visual storytelling behind the original silent film, which you can watch for free on YouTube, which is how I did it, And if you watch it, you kind of end up going like, oh, no, these dudes carried it off, with very, like, this still hits, even though it's a silent film and it contains all the limitations of the era. But it was so cool being the setup person, because I thought, like, okay, if you get through this and it's tidy and it's neat, y'all can just jam on the second part. And it was, you can let it roll. The one part in the first book that I wanted to take that I just abandoned, because, sometimes you're writing and you go, I can go right or I can go left. And you look down at left and you go, whoo, that's a long path. There's a lot there. Or I can take the short way and I can get straight to the next part, which is probably what the reader wants me to do. There's a gap in the book between Byers' chapter in the mountains and the Great Train Robbery. There's a gap there where they could have gone on for like a pretty long time raising hell in the backcountry before trying the train robbery and prep for it. Like there's about 50 pages there, at least 40 to 50 pages, that I was like, you know what? Let's just get to the point, because it'd be cool to write.
And
there's a Clone War segment there that like I just had to snip out, because you're like, we're already pretty deep into the meter here.
And we just addressed that. Like we had two of the lady gangsters say, like, a month ago when we were doing the preparation job, you messed this up, right? Like we sort of montaged it with
right.
Dialogue after the fact.
Like, but that month is there in my head. You're just like, it just didn't fit.
The best shortcut, I think, of the whole book is when Spencer, there's a part where Spencer writes as sort of the omniscient narrator that Mary would take care of the heist, like materials and like litigious planning. We just sort of like barreled right through some of that stuff.
Listen, bitch is busy, okay? that's the whole time I thought about the Mary character. I was like, whoo, she is busy. Like, she is moving. She is doing so much stuff to make this happen, And because you have to have a character like that who you can just go, yeah, rub a little bit of them on it. They'll make it happen. If you have somebody who's a fixer in like the first 15 or 20 pages, then they can save you like 100 pages down the road by being like, They just did that. That's like one thing Tolkien does all the time. It's like, well, Gandalf went and did this, and you're like, Gandalf's pretty handy. I bet he took
Tom
care of that.
Tom Bombadil's got this whole chapter.
He's got it, man. Yeah.
That was so like speaking of genre. One of my favorite things about this was like Spencer, you're like westerns, like there was a lot of this where we're like my ideas of westerns are like Cormac McCarthy and the Book of Ezekiel, whereas you have actually seen westerns and read westerns, so like you were able to play with the tropes of the genre, whereas I think the three of us could then it sort of freed us up creatively, right? Like you could have fun with the existing tropes, and we're just kind of fucking making up our own,
Yeah, and that was cool too, because like I could lean on genre if you guys had a question about something, and go, okay, well, this is what they did in other westerns, and this is either why I'm doing it or why I didn't. I thought the cool thing was in the second half of the book, y'all all relied on different things. Like Jason in particular relied on like a real biblical tone, which works like crazy when you keep it as consistent as you did, which is new to me too, because like I don't do a lot of Bible reading. Wasn't raised with it. I'm Catholic. Somebody else reads the Bible for me, tells me what it means. That was how I was raised. So it was wild. It was wild to read how it was wild to watch how everybody got on their particular pony of choice and just rode.
So I'd say before we go to the next question and talking about kind of genre mixing, and I'm looking through some of my old notebooks here, and going back to the Bear Wallace thing, I just see a note that says Bear with Wallace, maybe monster truck.
Which we did do this. We do have a monster truck in there.
We do have a monster truck in there, never forget. Okay, the next is sort of broader college football history when we talk about this, and this question comes from Adam F. You touch a little bit on alternate history, counterfactuals, and what ifs for the system when you talk about college basketball. Are there other pivot points you think about, and what might have been the outcome? I think Alex is the best person to answer that because he sort of did most of the history stuff there. I will say mine quickly is that I really think about a lot what would have happened if the Rose Bowl would have invited 4 teams instead of 2. I think about that all the time. I think we could have been saved 100 years. But Alex, what did you think about that?
So Jason mentioned earlier, what if Bear Bryant went to Arkansas on one of the numerous occasions where Arkansas, which is the flagship school of his home state, what if they go and get him? I have one that's more painful for me, given where I went to college, is just what if Bear Bryant did not leave Maryland? I think about this one a lot because it's interesting, because I have rooted for years now for a very bad Maryland football program, but also just because the tentacles of that, if Bear Bryant didn't leave Maryland, would, I think, really change so much about college sports.
The South.
You might be familiar.
The South.
So much, really. Y'all are probably familiar with it that Bear Bryant spends one season coaching at Maryland, basically right after World War II, 1945. It's his first head coaching job. And he's only there for a year because he clashes a lot with Curly Byrd, who is the president of Maryland at the time. The students actually marched on Byrd's house when Bryant left because the idea was that Byrd had sort of meddled in Bryant's football program at Maryland. Bryant had only been there for a year, but he'd taken them from a losing team to 6-2-1. He was at this point a pretty up and coming coach. He goes to Kentucky, and this is where things really start to get you into like the wow, how would college sports be different? Because obviously you can think, sure, if he stays in Maryland, does Maryland win some national titles? They do wind up with one claim title, but is Maryland a really good program for decades? Is Alabama not? Those are the easy ones. I think when you get to the next level, if Bear Bryant does not go to Kentucky, I think Kentucky is forever changed by that. Not only is Kentucky going to miss out on its only really great era of football ever, but also Kentucky might not get into the giant trouble that it winds up getting into in 1952 with the NCAA, or maybe 1950, 1952. The nucleus of this, or the genesis of it, I should say, is that Bear Bryant goes to Kentucky and he is immediately paid way more money than Kentucky's very famous basketball coach, Adolph Rupp. who, by the way, we learned throughout the research in this book, and I think a lot of people who haven't researched the book know it too. Adolf Rupp, irredeemable figure, one of the worst people to ever be involved with college sports in any capacity, completely irredeemable in every way. But because Kentucky brings in Bear Bryant and decides we want to have this big football program, they also kind of start letting Rupp do whatever he wants, because Rupp was a famously jealous guy who did not really like that he has won all these national championships, and now you're paying someone more than me, you're giving him more resources to build his program than me. Kentucky, it's safe to say, I think probably let some institutional control go over the basketball program because they had hired Bear Bryant for football. This winds up with a massive gambling scandal that goes very deep into Adolf Rupp's basketball program. From there, you get Kentucky being the subject of the first real NCAA investigation ever, after the Sinful Seven had kind of busted up the NCAA's old model of enforcement. I think that you could very plausibly argue that if Bear Bryant doesn't leave Maryland for Kentucky, then Kentucky does not wind up in the crosshairs of the NCAA. Kentucky does not roll over for the NCAA, does not legitimize NCAA enforcement, and the next 7 decades of NCAA investigations are nothing like what they actually turned out to be. To say nothing of, and Richard mentioned this, the entire South is different too. I mean, that doesn't even, what is Texas A&M? What is Alabama? You don't know. Bear Bryant leaving Maryland after the 1945 season, and I know I've been going on for a while about this, but it's only because it's very important, changed the entire future of college sports in basically every corner of college sports. And honestly, you could write a whole book just about that what if. Maybe, who knows? Maybe someday I will.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. Like, Bear Bryant is the through line of the sport from World War II until quite literally the mid-90s. I mean, he just is. And there's no way you can tell the story of college football and college sports in general without him, frankly. And it is absolutely fascinating. He's an absolutely fascinating figure. And Jason, I know sort of as we sort of batted around what to do with him, there's not really much, there's not really any boundaries to his myth, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah. So I when you're writing about a real person, I hate like mythologizing them and characterizing them and treating them like they're a character that was invented on the page, and like trying to psychoanalyze from afar and like reducing an actual living human to a theme. There are exceptions. If you were born a college football fan after by the way, born a college football fan like it's a religion, yes, that's accurate. In the South after Bear Bryant died, this is an American myth. This is Paul Bunyan. So like going back and reading which we all did we read his autobiography. We read like, tons of stuff about him, and we kept coming back to this idea of like, this was this super badass, like the scariest person in an extremely violent sport, the most competitive person alive, but he was also terrified of little men in suits. And like, we all sort of independently came back to that idea. And for me, writing about Bear Bryant, it's like the complicity of power, right? Like being a step below the actual top institutional power, and never having the courage to challenge the thing that is technically one step above you, but is culturally it might not be, So like in terms of an alternate history, the thing I just kept coming back to is, what if Bear Bryant had spoken up, right? What if Bear Bryant had come out and said, even if it's strictly in utilitarian terms, hey, we need the best football team we possibly can. We need to integrate Alabama.
15 years before he did.
Yes, and I know there's an endless debate about how hard he tried, how much he might have wanted to, etc. But it's still tantalizing to go back and think about how much he could have done and what that says about, hey, college football coaches to this day.
People I think they miss the point when they talk about Bear Bryant the way that they do. People say, binary. Too binary. I mean, so it's like, was Bear Bryant a big racist, or how did he compare to the other contemporaries of his time? I think you reframe the discussion, and I hope that this book did that a little bit, which is, if there was something that Bear Bryant really wanted, he was a tornado in making that happen. He was an unstoppable force at getting young men who he had power over and who wore football pads to do whatever it was that he needed. And he just did not have that same energy when it came to making the world a better place. And if you're the marginalized, then I guess it doesn't really matter what he had in his heart. It's about what he did. And he didn't do a whole lot until it was pretty late in the game.
I think it's much easier to do that when you turn him into a bear. I've always thought that the way to actually tell the truth about somebody is to turn them into something entirely else, right? Turn them into something totally different, and then you can work with them. It's like people who can only cry at cartoons, right? Like the actual emotion might be too close for you, but if I can project it on a wall in a different shape, you'll still recognize it, and it'll be just distanced enough to where you can touch it. And it's like putting everything through a pinhole camera. It's like watching an eclipse through a pinhole camera. You can't look right at it, but it'll be a lot more tolerable and clear to you, but also still affecting if I can distance it, if I can take it a step away from it.
Tyson, I think, is the most interesting person in sort of the group of us because, like, we've all sort of grown up around college football, or, Alex went to college and sort of started learning at it at a more sort of advanced pace. But me, Spencer, and Jason grew up via osmosis in the South or whatever. But Tyson, is somebody who was not weaned on college football, who does not really watch college football, what was your favorite character or sort of just weirdest thing throughout working through this?
You are correct. I went to art school where sports did not exist, so I had to find my own veins as far as entertainment in that capacity. But we keep talking about Bear Bryant, and Jason, you just mentioned he's this monolith of a human being who's afraid of men in little suits, or little men, and they probably wear little suits because they're little. But anyways, but you said something when we were kind of we were writing the end of the book, and you were talking about when Jack Trice kills Wallace, and maybe it was you, Richard, when we were in a meeting, and you said this is the moment where you kind of turn back and you look at Bryant and say oh, well, you should have killed this guy years ago. This is on you. You should have been doing this. And so that moment in the book was really interesting for me, and it made the bear really, it kind of solidified him as a character in my head, because he was like a mythical creature up until that point almost, where his only purpose was to just destroy. And I like that. Like you said, the line through that whole story is really, really interesting. Outside of that, the whole Irish, I think in any character in this whole story, I loved reading, and I'm going to maybe slightly go off on a tangent and maybe not fully answer the question, but every time I'd read a nonfiction part, I was excited to see how that was going to translate, and who, the metaphors you were going to create, and how is this school going to be personified in an animal or a creature or a sentence. And I was excited while reading all these, and I didn't really get all of that till the end, because a lot of the chapters we were reviewing and I was making art for was kind of out of order. And so when we put it all together, it was so fun to read. So you'd get a character like Irish, and I didn't really know this backstory. I didn't really know, I'd read that nonfiction first, and then I'd go, oh my God, this is the perfect way. This is what this makes so much sense. And it was just an absolute pleasure to see that from a non-college football kind of background. And if anyone who is I don't know, it'd be hard, you're listening to this and you're not a college football fan, I try and get people who aren't college football fans to read this, because you'd be surprised how many people would be interested in this, the history behind it, because it's so fascinating. There are so many good villains. I mean, not great for our country and us as human beings, but there's so many villains that you want to get killed, and it's just the history and the way the characters you kind of personify from that history is so good. And it's kind of hard for me to choose an absolute favorite, but
Okay, I will add before we sort of move on to more broader about like characters, there's one question that I wanted to hit from Nico, and I think Jason answered it. It is in the notes. It is the Bear chapters made me really want to read a book about the history of college football and Jim Crow, how football upheld segregation within teams and the broader public, and how programs ultimately and unevenly integrated. Does that book exist? And if it doesn't, would one of you write it? Thanks.
I asked our friend Matt Brown of the Extra Points newsletter, the like big college football history guy, for a few recommendations on this. He gave us Horns, Hogs, and Nixon by Terry Frey. That would be right dead center of the civil rights era. College Football and American Culture in the Cold War Era by Kurt Edward Kemper, and Breaking the Line by Samuel G. Friedman. And Matt's recommendations on that kind of thing are always really good.
I recommend a book by Derek White. He's a professor at Kentucky, also has been at my alma mater, Maryland, and a number of places. He wrote a book called Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Jake Gaither, Florida A&M, in the History of Black College Football, which is not strictly speaking about what that question is about, but that gets into that. I think if you read it, it kind of it's about football at HBCUs predominantly, but in telling that story, it also tells a lot of the story about how PWIs handled issues of race, spoiler, poorly over the decades of this sport, and it's a good read that I recommend.
Yeah, there is that book that Alex referenced actually is, I read that in college, and basically that book to me sort of solidified the fact that I don't want to say nothing before roughly 1975 in this sport matters, but nothing before roughly 1975 in this sport matters. This sport is the AD and BC moment in this sport is integration for what the sport was, for what the sport truly meant to all of the country, not just 70% of it, and all that sort of stuff. And that's I've always sort of thought of the sport as two different distinct eras after reading that book. Okay, so I will move us on to more broader history. This one is for Spencer. I love the book. This comes from Loram. I love the book and the wonderfully accurate portrayal of each character. My question, what was the creation process for each of the Sinful Seven? I'm fascinated with Cav and her backstory.
Before Spencer answers that, if you've read the book, the Sinful Seven is a real thing, and it's 7 schools that basically told the NCAA to fuck off. No, we are not going to stop paying athletes. And the result of that was that the NCAA had to basically change its rules because they couldn't do anything to those schools. Spencer.
So I was trying to think of a character like in order. You have to go, okay, well, it's got to fit with the archetype. It's got to fit with the school, right? And it's got to fit with the story. So, there were some that you go, okay, well, I have a lot of meat on the bone, and then there were some that you just go, yeah, there's not a whole lot to work with here. So they're probably going to be relatively minor characters, right?
Could I break in on one thing there?
Sure.
There was part of the real story that helped us out a little bit because Virginia really was in real life kind of the ringleader, right?
Yeah.
So that sort of set us up a little bit.
Yeah, that helped. I think it also helped, that one of them was a Cavalier. So that was a start. And to go, okay, well, what does this swashbuckling person look like? And it was very weird in that, like, one of the last calculations was realizing that you were writing about all women. And so you try to step very gently in that, because if you're a dude and you're writing,
they weren't always women.
Right. They weren't always women, right? Like we were like, okay. But at one point I can't even really answer why. It just felt cool to write an entire all-lady gang and to do it in a manner where you weren't really leaning on that too much. It was just there. And it also helped because I just thought it was fun to write a lady Cavalier. Like that just felt really cool. So in evolving each of them, I just thought, well, you need one character who has, like, I think it's important to have a character who always has delusions of grandeur but can't quite live up to them, or if they do, it feels accidental, right? Their genius should feel accidental. Like, I love characters like that, and UVA always struck me as that because UVA has this grand idea of what UVA should be. We don't call it the campus, we call it the grounds, right? We have the lawn. We have this really grandiose looking football stadium, and you look at them as a football program and you're like, it's crap. This is a crap football program. You guys, you have this gigantic, grandiose mascot, and you cite Thomas Jefferson as your founder, and in reality, it's just it's another land grant university that has ties to a slaveholder.
You were ranked number 1 in 1993, and that's it.
8-5 is a highlight, y'all. But the Cavalier, I really liked that idea as a central character for somebody who definitely had the vision, but couldn't quite pull it off. Virginia Tech was a little bit easier to me because once you got the Cavalier character, then the flip side of Virginia, and I think of most places, is that every state has this side, right? One university is the we make the lawyers who ruin everything, and there's another university that hates them because they build everything. They just don't do all of the we arrange the venture capital, right? And that's Virginia Tech. So it was much easier to have that sort of duality of, okay, well, that's going to be her sister, and she's going to be really, really good at all of the things that actually matter, but getting her to show up is hard because you hate each other. So there's a natural there's two what you need in a character, right? I know I'm going to go long, but the other characters will be quick. What you need in a character is you need them to want something, and what Cav wants really badly is she wants some way to redeem all that is sort of incomplete and unfulfilled about her designs, right? She needs to get from point A to B. And in the end, what she does is she gets that, and she manages to do something which is actually really selfless, and to also sort of at least get to a point of resolution with her sister and say, we're set. We were apart. We need each other. We can't really be together because neither of us are that kind of person. But here's what I can do to sort of cinch things up at the end of my life.
She gets her moment of redemption, but she gets to do it her way because it's still badass and off the cuff.
Right. It is badass and off the cuff. It's just it's like everything else that's really good for her. It falls in by accident. She just happens to live up to everything that a Cavalier should be in, in the end, and does it in her own kind of insane, very dashing kind of way. Mary's I thought who's really competent? I'm a turtle's real competent. They're not real fast, but a turtle is completely cut off. They're survivors. They're protected. When everything else, when the dust settles, the turtle or the tortoise in any situation is the one who, manages to crawl out of the wreckage. So the turtle was always going to be the wise older type, right? It was just fun to give her a sniper rifle. The Witches for Hire, that was really just going, well, wouldn't it be cool to just, okay, Boston College, would be the Jesuitical kind of super intelligent thing that Boston College is, just make them a witch, and Villanova is just not too far off from that, but we can kind of vibe off the name and make her something a little more Southwestern.
I think part of that was these are the Northeastern private schools, so they should be different. They should be literally on a different plane, different level.
Yeah, just like the other two, these were people who were all on the same side, but for very different reasons, all of them. Let's see. God, this is the hard part about fiction.
Then you had the two FCS ladies.
Charlie and Lexi.
Yeah, so who were both military Southern associated, and everybody I knew who ever went to those things, they were just mean as snakes. So I was okay, let's just make two mean people with knives. You need that in a crew, right? And also everybody I know who went to the Citadel and VMI, they were just kind of a little off. So you just make the South Carolinian one really, really weird and very violent, right? And you make the VMI one be the one who's just like, I got gear, because you need somebody in a crew with gear, right? So that was why kind of where they ended up was going. Okay, so you need two people who die. You need two people who die quickly too. You need two people who are just like cannon fodder. Like that's another thing. Like if you watch like the Dirty Dozen, like when I was thinking, when you go through any kind of like 10 Little Indians movie where they're just kind of picking off characters, and you go, well, who's gonna live? There's always two who are like real cool. And I thought about Aliens, because Aliens, two of the coolest people who are the big swivel gunners, Vasquez and her man, right? Like they're taken out real quickly. And I thought like that's always like fun to do, is to parade that in front of the reader and then go, okay, we've completely killed those people to show you how serious this environment is, and in addition to that, to give you a red herring.
Yeah, and also it's easier to focus. Like,
yeah.
It would be impossible to keep track of like a train fight where we have to keep track of where 7 people are, right? So like you get the double benefit of we're selling how tragic this is, how hard it's going to be without your big guns, and also we're focusing, ever closer on 2 characters, because Mary, we know, Mary's too smart to get killed in this stupid mess, right? So we're just narrowing our focus down to the 2 core characters of the gang.
My favorite part of the book, my favorite piece of dialogue in the book, is when I believe it's Charlie says to Mary, "Granny, are we unhitching or we bitching?" Before they get on with it. That is my favorite piece of dialogue in the whole book. I also love that for Mary, there wasn't an ending for Mary's story, and I think we ended up sort of coming around to like, there's, like Spencer said, there's no way she gets killed in this. She just dips off and goes to the Gulf Coast with some blue crab and hangs out. But I will say one of the most beautiful scenes in the whole story is when Spencer lays out the dynamic between the sisters, Virginia and Polly, or Cav and Polly, and sort of how they like both needed each other and didn't want to admit it. Like that is like literally poetic shit. But the most poetic part of the book is, of course, Alex's Yinzer chapter. I'm just going to clear the deck because I don't even know all of the backstory and how Alex and Jason sort of put their heads together and figure it. All I know is that we got like 2 weeks before we wanted it finished, and Alex didn't have a fiction chapter, and then from the ashes, this arose.
Yeah, so I was the only person in our little book writing quintet here that had not done any fiction work or really any creative work. My chapters that I spent a lot of time working on and many thousands of words on were all just about the history, and it was sort of building scaffolding that the fiction could fit around. And we just thought it might be fun to give that a shot, because I don't think I'd ever written fiction unless I did in like elementary school creative writing or something like that. And I think that in our little corner of the internet, this sicko but wonderful corner of the internet that we inhabit, there's a lot of people who really enjoy Pitt and Pitt humor. Though, of course, we never tell a joke about Pitt. And we're talking about the kind of the world building stuff that we were doing earlier. We had these transfer portals that we agreed would sort of work. And we thought that they might be a great fit in a place called Arn City, A-R-N City, which, of course, is an allegory for my wonderful hometown of Pittsburgh. And also, it was just a chance to write some very Yinzer-y stuff. I have a cousin who is as Yinzer as Yinzers get, and we developed these characters, Dr. Ditka Wanstedt and his assistant Bino, and just had them kind of talk to each other about this big crisis that was coming to Arn City. And when I was doing the dialogue, the basic plot of it is that there's a mountaineer gang that's coming to take all the condiments from Arn City, and Dr. Ditka just they can't have that. So we're going to use some transfer portals to intercept them, and then that's how West Virginia winds up off in the Great Southwest, or how the Mountaineer Gang does. And we just put a lot of dialogue in there that was fun for me to do because I was just writing it in my cousin's voice, in a very thick Pittsburghese accent. And if you read it and you understood what it meant, to see Doc Dick, I got just about the worst news I ever had. If you're able to read, the way that I wrote that was just, in my cousin's voice, and a few people have said that they actually understood it. Because there's this kind of dialect from Western Pennsylvania that I'm sure I have a little bit of it, but it's not really like a dominant influence on the way I talk. But I would hope that, especially if people are from Pittsburgh, they thought it was funny. If they just think Yinzer accents sound funny, that's fine. Yinzers are not a marginalized community, folks, so it's fine to make fun of Yinzer accents. Like, you're not doing anything problematic if you do that.
Alex, are Yinzers the Italians of America?
Maybe. Yeah, I mean, it's
okay.
This has not been Yinzers have not been a marginalized community. There could perhaps be a little bit of let them eat cake sentiment in there, but I'm from there, so I can say it, and it's fine. And it was fun to try to write out what that voice actually sounds like. We gotta do something about this. A goddamn disgrace. It's just like, that's how a Yinzer that's how it would sound if you're going up to, I don't know, Wexford or Monongahela or Monessen and just, talk to someone in a diner. That's what it would sound like. And so it was fun to do that and to make that part of our little fiction. I appreciate you guys letting me do it.
I remember this was literally like a week before we went at copy deadline.
It was the last thing we put in the book.
It was Spencer's songs were after this.
Oh, yes.
We were adding shit literally past the deadline Tyson gave us, but with Tyson's approval, of course.
I knew that was going to happen either way, so I prepared my mind and body for those types.
Tyson added a week buffer just because shit's going to keep rolling. But it was like, so I sort of looked around and like at this point Spencer had added an interlude. A nonfiction interlude. It's like a short blog post about Notre Dame and how they used to be cool. They used to be Antifa. And at that point, almost all of us had a little bit of fiction and a little bit of nonfiction, except for Alex. So if it felt like we needed to, Alex should be able to create something fun and original and weird. The transfer portal is wide open for whatever anyone wants to say. Anything anyone says about the transfer portal is canon.
That was when we didn't know what it was supposed to be.
At this point, we had long punted on explaining what it is or how it works. But Spencer has it. It's the bottom of a well. You have it. It's a brick-lined thing that you can affect with science. I have it. It's like a glowing thing in a forest. So Alex has his own view on it. Where it's like an industrial project gone wrong. And it was let's add some more confusing lore, really muddy that up. But obviously the main star of the chapter is just Alex typing amazing Yinzer shit.
Yeah, and by the way, for me, when it came time to problem solve, video game and open world video game structure was so handy because when you said, okay, well, it's at the bottom of a well, I'm like, oh, these are discoverables. That's fine. We could do bottom of a well. Sure, there'd be one over here. There could be one over here. Find them all. They're scattered all over. There's IGN.com says there were 83 transfer portals scattered all over this, and it'll give me all the locations, or I can just know how many. It depends on how deep I want to go in the tutorial. Yeah, it was part of the fun of adding things until the last second was sort of daring yourself and or other people to see what they would come up with, and I was never disappointed. Even in my own stuff, which I'm fairly, not too big on. I'm fairly skeptical of. It was fun to just go, no, we could do this and we could do that. I see how people get stuck in the studio too long now.
Alex, you wrote that part in a night, in one night, and then you came back the next morning and you're like, see you later, and you just dropped it and left, and then we spent the rest of the day laughing.
Well, Jason has a way of telling me to slow down after I tend to operate pretty quickly if left to my own accord, but sometimes, you don't want that to sacrifice quality. So you need an editor, or in this case, 4 editors, to make sure that everything is regular and that you're not being fast but not good.
I remember not knowing what exactly an edit note would be on that part. I remember reading it. I was literally lying on my couch. I read it on my phone. I thought it was the funniest shit I'd ever written. And I remember I think I added one note. I was like, is this literally English? And the rest of it, I was like, I don't even know what you changed here.
Well, I do this a lot with Spencer. Go ahead, Jason.
Well, in Alex's Yinzer chapter, 90% of the edit notes, I was saying less narration, more dialogue. Like, keep the story as it is. Just have Dave Wannstedt telling me the story. You know what I mean? Like, more Yinzer was basically 90% of the notes.
Yeah. Sometimes, like, you know, we write things that are so weird as a group that, and Spencer does this a lot. Like, Spencer is people might think when, you know, you read Spencer's writing, you just think, wow, like, it just comes out naturally like this. Spencer actually accepts a lot of edit help and like takes feedback from anybody on his team and is really good at that and incorporating it and is really deliberate about it. But there are times when Spencer writes things, and he did a newsletter like this recently where I'm just like, all right, I'm just pretty much getting out of the way here. I don't really have a lot to do here. I'm just gonna, you know, I'll make sure there's not a missing hyphen or something like that. And otherwise, you know, just get this thing on the truck and ship it out.
I mean this in the best possible way, that it's a lot like your Yinzer chapter. Somebody comes to you and they say, I've made a frog rocket. And you go, well, what is a frog rocket? And they'll go, well, it's half rocket, half frog, you know? And you just go, you know what? I can't make a frog rocket. You made a frog rocket, so let's just put it out on the showroom floor and see what people think of it, you know? Like, you just make something which is kind of singular and weird in its own little thing. You can't really criticize something like that, right? It's like when a 7-year-old is explaining to you what they've made with Lego, and you go, you know, like,
great.
This doesn't exist, and I can't critique something that doesn't exist, so let's just let it roll.
It's all fun and games till someone has to draw it.
Yeah, right. Which is, by the way, like, there's an anecdote that is my favorite, like, creative anecdote ever about doing anything remotely creative, and it's from the annals of the Muppet Show, and their head writer said that the first week he was like, I'm just going to come up with some weird shit, because it was the 70s, and they're all doing drugs, and he just said, here, I'm just going to come up with some weird shit, and I'm going to see if anybody rejects it, and they didn't. So the next week, he's like, okay, I'm going to push this a little bit further. So he made something weirder, and they just were like, yeah, this is awesome. So he kept trying to write things they wouldn't do, and they never said no. They always said, yeah, we can do that. Sure. You want, like, you know, pigs in a World War I battlefield singing, why can't we be friends? Yeah, let's do it. And that was kind of what I tried to do with you, Tyson. It was to come up with something where I was like, let's see if he'll just say no. And you never did.
I challenge you. Like, I invite that, though, because it's like, I love the challenge of trying to be broken in some way, as far as just like personifying something. It's like, yes, give me the frog rock. Like, it's like, I'm gonna take a stab at it, and if I'm way off, I'll just redo it. Like that. That's as easy as that. I'll take another chance. But it goes back to, you guys made it easy, because when you would say something like frog rocket, you would then you would write about it in such a way where it's like, I get it, and I mean, it was so good. So fun, making me draw zombies and bears, and you guys,
zombie bears.
You guys, this is such a fun project. I get excited when I start talking about it.
Having Tyson on this was such a cheat code. Like having Tyson's art at the beginning of a chapter, it was like, man, you know, I don't have to describe, you know, nitty gritty details, because there's already the reader has already seen a beautiful illustration of it, you know. It was so fun to have words and art bringing each other to life.
Yeah, and Jason, I think sort of for me and you, I guess there's a question here about sort of the Bear and Wallace and how that became sort of a good bridge from sort of the Sinful 7 part of the book to, you know, your epilogue and through sort of the Bama lands and stuff like that. There's also a question about how Big Cow is essentially Matthew McConaughey. He literally has Matthew McConaughey's voice. So I guess, even though we all hate talk about questions, I guess, Jason, talk about the fact that we sort of did Texas A&M lore and we didn't really tweak much because it's Texas A&M.
Yeah, I mean, it's already the weirdest place on earth, so how much weirder can you really make it? It was a blast to write. Like, I reread Junction Boys, and I read a bunch of other Aggie stuff. Someone sent me like Aggie band lore. It is literally more complicated than a lot of religions. It's an amazing place, and taking that and, all right, what's our main conflict? It's going to be Texas, obviously. And then, all right, so we have on the Shutdown Fullcast, we've long had this joke about Big Cow, referring to their mascot, the university is in general, as Big Cow. So, like, what's the single most fun thing we can do is literally Bear has to face a big cow. And someone compared it to like an anime battle, just a big, huge thundering thunderbolt strikes, and like everything is completely over the top and absurd. I wanted it violent and metal and just lots of stuff being broken. But Big Cow, I needed to differentiate him from the bear. The bear grunts, which that's how Bear Bryant talks. Short sentences blurted at you. I needed like a really verbose and kind of obnoxious villain, and it had to be identifiably Austin, and like Matthew McConaughey, like, I don't necessarily think he's a villain or anything, but like such an identifiable way of speaking where Jimmy Gardner on Twitter is kind of the version of Matthew McConaughey that I'm messing around with there, where it's like mixing together a bunch of languages and like, does he even know what he's saying? And like, it was a lot of fun to write. And later, when Big Cow comes back, he's sort of refined a slightly more virtuous version of him. With that, we go Jimmy Jamale instead of Matthew McConaughey. Joe Jamale, excuse me, instead of Matthew McConaughey toward the end. But yeah, basically it was just making him identifiably Austin.
Fat boy.
You brought up the kind of like biblical level of, so when I was drawing the bear for that, like, one of the section chapters, it's like the one edit that you had for me was like, can you make it more biblical? And my response was, how much blood can I put on it? And all you said back, I want it biblical. And that was the only thing you would tell me. And I said, okay. I put the thunder, got the lightning, got the blood.
So that came about from one of Spencer's notes on my bear chapter, was basically like, this is kind of biblical. How much further can we take it? And I'm like, Tyson, how much further can we take? And so like I tried to lean into that, and Tyson adds like fire and lightning and thunder to the art, and the section headers go from numbers to actually the Quran is actually what I used for sort of the section headers in the bear chapter. But yeah, I just all I care about is it metal or not.
It was really easy to design around that, and it's like cool. Like, I'm so down for that. It was just you made that, designing that chapter, like, and making each chapter feel like it's designed in its own and laid out in its own specific way. Like, felt, I don't know, so good. Having the freedom to do that, because I don't think there would ever be like an art director who would ever let me do that in any capacity ever. So it was nice to have that freedom.
The best art thing for me, and it's selfish because it's my chapter, but the duality of the Jacks. The original Jack, the first Jack drawing is just it's the statue that was originally outside of Iowa State's football stadium, has been moved across campus since, and then sort of taking that adaptation and putting the gun sort of on his shoulder, and the visual representation of taking Jack the victim and bringing him into, the world that we had created with the Sinful Seven. That drawing is my favorite, and sort of the first Jack read through victim chapter, turn page, oh shit, like it's about to get real because we're going into our fictional world, is like the favorite sort of turn artistically that we did with all the art. Because originally that was, I think it was one long chapter. And then you guys asked me to break it up, and I asked Tyson to break it up visually, and he did. And I thought that was incredible. But like, so, we got a couple questions that were basically like, Bear and Wallace and sort of how they got ported into the Jack story and mixed up. Originally, probably my only big cutting room floor stuff was there was a lot more Bear and Jack in my part of that second book, so to speak. And I think we ended up getting rid of that. I think there was a much more intricate map that Tyson had that will never see the light of day. And we sort of backed off of the Wallace in there and put in the Jack, more Jack, into that sort of fictional Jack chapter. Originally, I remember I was in the park laying around, and it was right after Spencer basically said you should write the fiction of Bear, Wallace, Jack, etc. instead of him doing it. I had sort of put out the parameters for it, and Spencer was going to fill in the details with that fiction part, and then Spencer was like, no, you should actually write it. And I remember not knowing what I was going to do, and I remember this was the starting point. I saw Booker T's middle name was Taliaferro. And that actually, Professor Taliaferro, is supposed to represent Booker T. Washington. And no one actually picked up on that. At least no one's tweeted it at me. And that was another question that we got. What is the one reference cameo you don't think anybody has noticed? I don't think anybody noticed that. But there is also another level to it. And I can't remember it specifically, but I'm pretty sure there's a guy named Taliaferro who was one of the first black players in the NFL or something to that point. So there was a double sort of meaning there that I don't think anybody actually picked up on, which is I just thought was really funny. Can
I put in one?
Go ahead.
I got one that I really hope that people caught. Maybe my favorite subtle reference in the book, but you have to follow college football news very closely. The sheriff is talking to Byers during the SMU epilogue, or the Methodist epilogue, excuse me. And he says something to the effect of, as far as paying them, professionalizing all of this, that's where you lose me. I'll go do something else because there's enough entitlement in the world as it is. Anyone know who said that in real life?
The Bear?
It's my gun.
Well, it's probably the coach I was also thinking of when I was writing about the Bear.
Dabo Sweeney said that in
Dabo.
real life. That was when he threatened to leave college football if players were allowed to be paid. And Jason just snuck that in there or maybe he didn't actually. I mean, like we say, all references to real people or events are strictly coincidental in this book.
Yeah, I can't believe that happened. My favorite reference that this was a thing we planned early on. So George Irish is the name of the brawling Irishman who the sheriff accidentally / heroically kills. Mm-hmm. And then we later discover he's a zombie. So this is a man named George Irish being exhumed. George Gipp, the most legendary Notre Dame player, was in fact exhumed 13 years ago. And like, that was sort of that someone asked about that. That was sort of the inspiration for that happening in our story.
That makes one of my notes in my sketchbook make so much sense now. Oh my god!
You didn't know?
No, I think I remember hearing it. I must have written a note down about it because I'm like looking through here, and then all of a sudden it just says "Zombie Irish Gipp?" ? Why do I have so many question marks? I don't know. But it's like I was like, who? I'm like, I don't remember like that name being in the book anywhere or something like that. And you just said it there, and I was like, oh my god, everything is connected.
Everything is always connected. Unless anybody has anything else, I think we're about done here. The last few questions that we've gotten: will there ever be any sequels? Audiobook, physical book. I want someone to perform the songs written in the book. Cuppy Cup on Twitter had somebody perform one of the songs in the book. I know the first one, I think. As far as sequels, audiobook, physical book, we are working on sort of all those those constellation of ideas and what's next. That's not to mean we are literally recording an audiobook or figuring out a physical book. Right now, we're still sort of tossing around how to do it. These are things we want to do. I think that there is a lot of untrodden ground in sort of college football lore, college sports lore. And I would, my fever dream is to have sort of a Sinful 7 cinematic universe that is built out apart from this, that includes this, of course.
If you are listening to this podcast and you want to work with us or have any ideas about smart ways to make any of those things a reality, then hey, you do know where to find us.
Call us.
You certainly do know where to find us. Okay, Jason, where can the people find you these days?
I am at the Jason Kirk on Twitter. JasonKirk.substack.com is a newsletter I barely ever do anything at. And also I work with Moon Crew on a daily basis.
Spencer?
Also working with Moon Crew on a daily basis at the Shutdown Fullcast twice a week during the season, available on any of your favorite podcast services. Also at Thinking Out Loud on the SEC Network with you, Richard, and Brandon Boykin, and the incomparable Alyssa Lang every Monday at 7. I'm at EDSBS on Twitter. Sometimes I show up on Twitch. It's not a regular thing. It's whenever I want to, basically. I did Fuser the other night. That was fun, being a terrible DJ. Being a terrible DJ is way better than being a good DJ, y'all. But that is where you can find me for the moment.
Tyson.
I'm just Tyson_Whiting on Twitter. If you just want some random Washington hockey nonsense, that's where you're going to get it. Or else you could look for more work from me at a SB Nation or Secret Base.
Alex.
I co-host Split Zone Duo. It's a podcast that I think you're already aware of, because if you're not, then it would be impossible for you to be listening to this recording. Thank you for listening, and you can find me at Alex_Kirshner on Twitter.
I am at RJ_Rice on Twitter. I do a lot of stuff, including Thinking Out Loud with Spencer, but I legitimately a highlight I think that I will always have forever is working on this book with you guys. Even if we never do anything else with it or any part of the cinematic universe, it was a pleasure. And in many ways this summer, I know I needed this project. I needed this world to go into every day, more or less, to escape from this one for a few hours or days at a time. And you know, I thanks, honestly, for putting your time and your efforts into this and making it as good as it was. I am so proud of this silly little book, even if it doesn't go anywhere from here. So, hope you enjoyed the podcast. Hope you buy the book. It's at sinful7.com through the end of 2020 calendar year. It'll be 99 cents and up. That means pay whatever you want, above 99 cents, I guess. 20% of the proceeds will go to the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. Alex, we're out of here, eh?
We're out of here. Thanks for reading. Thanks for listening. Thanks for rocking with us. And I hope that you have a wonderful and safe Thanksgiving week, please.
Well, hell yeah, y'all. That was pretty fun.
No, that was insanely fun.
That was great.
And